This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome, everyone, to the second in our series of webinars that are part of a larger project that the Turfgrass Science program here at Cornell is involved with, that's based at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And this is a state-funded part of New York State's DEC programs throughout the state. And it's the Pollution Prevention Institute. Many of you know we had the water webinar just a few weeks ago. This is the nutrient management, and we'll have a pesticide and a water quality one after the fact. Pesticide and pest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a
and
pesticide
point source pollution one as well.
Yeah, and point source pollution. Sorry, that's the one I'm missing. Anyway, it's this as part of a larger project. Many of you may know from paying attention to it. It was a very intentional approach of surveying a section of our industry at a Western, Central, and Finger Lakes, New York, that identified particular aspects of water quality protection as we define them using best management practices that were being adopted. And so there's the slide where we have evaluated adoption. We know where we're weak, and we're developing ways of improving that adoption through a variety of projects that include webinars, publications, videos, brief assistance projects, direct assistance projects that you'll hear more about over the coming year. And so this is part of our efforts to make people more aware about aspects of nutrient management that fit into this overall adoption scheme we're devising with our pal Rick Slattery, the former superintendent at Locust Hill Country Club. And now it's my pleasure to invite my colleague, Carl Scamenti, to take us through this very important part that I think everyone's going to be very impressed with the progressive way in which we're beginning to think about this, not just for water quality, but for also, playability and management of the golf course with less resources and less labor. So Carl, let's take us through this process, and then we'll rejoin you at the end here to have some question and answers.
Perfect. Thanks, Frank. Yeah, so as you said, we're going to focus on the nutrient management portion of this project, right? We have these 4 categories that we collected survey data on. And I think a good place to start is just to look at the data. And similar in our water management webinar, we talked with Rick and we looked through the data. We saw some BMPs we do really well, and also maybe some BMPs we're not so good at. So as you can see here on the right is our adoption rate. Obviously higher is better. And there are several categories we do really well in. Written fertilizer applications, so keeping records of our fertilizer applications during the year, we do well at that. Calibrating equipment, right? More than 75% of us do that. That's good. We may want to see that higher, but still overall good adoption there. Avoiding applying fertilizer in the rough areas. So a lot of times we talk about roughs. They're usually the closest to water bodies. They're a large acreage, require a lot of product if you are going to fertilize them. Only about 20% of golf courses do fertilize rough around our region. We understand there's quality concerns, right? Certain golf courses are going to have quality expectations that might affect whether they do that or not. Of course, we're sensitive to that, but overall, we see a lot of people are avoiding fertilizing roughs and avoiding some runoff and nutrient concerns there. And then avoiding fertilizing after October 15th. We'll talk about the science behind that today and why that's probably not a good idea. But again, we do really well avoiding fertilizer after the turf grass has basically stopped growing. So those are some of the BMPs we do really well at. And then of course, there's weak areas, as Frank mentioned. I think it's completely okay for us to acknowledge that we don't do some things really well. That's the first step in creating the awareness and then hopefully driving adoption. One of these ones over here, only 26% of us measure or predict growth rate of our turf grass. Some of you may have heard that we can do this and just haven't done it yet. Some of you may not have heard that. Again, we'll go through today why that's important and why I think more than 26% of us should do that. Only about 30% of people consider soil moisture when they're applying fertilizer. What does that mean? Well, if we have saturated soils, we're going to want to avoid applying fertilizer then, right? Only about 30% of us are flexible enough in our application regimen to consider soil moisture and maybe move applications around. Only 24% of people apply phosphorus according to MLSN guidelines. MLSN, haven't heard that acronym before. Again, we're going to go over that today. Basically, that's a way to interpret soil tests and apply phosphorus only when we need it. And then finally, one of the BMPs we don't do well at, the least adopted one, is documenting a nutrient management plan. This is one we had a lot of conversation with superintendents about. I'll talk about kind of the barriers to adoption of that specific BMP today, and hopefully we've created a resource that'll make that super easy, and hopefully that will drive that adoption rate up. So, okay, we see that variability in BMP, some really well adopted, some not well adopted. So what we said is, hey, let's draw some metaphors to golf, and let's create BMPs and put them in sections, par, birdie, eagle, right? And for us, the pars, the BMP pars should be broadly applicable to every golf course. They should be easily achievable, right? Maybe a little bit of effort here and there, but every golf course should be able to do these pars. They're the low-hanging fruit. We think everybody should really standardize those BMPs and make those necessary. The birdies is that level up, right? So now they're still broadly applied to every golf course, big or small, but they take a little bit more effort, right? Maybe they take a small amount of investment, whether that's time, labor, money, and everybody can still do them. They're just going to take a little bit more, right? A little bit aspirational, but still within the reach of all golf courses. And then the eagles. The eagles are really aspirational, right? Not everybody's going to be able to do every BMP. These are the ones that we understand, hey, you might have constraints, whether that's economic or labor. Certain sites may be able to do these better than others, requiring more effort, maybe a little bit more investment. They have a longer term aspect to them, and they're more advanced. So we kind of stratified these BMPs and we put them in this infographic poster. And for those not familiar with the project, this is kind of our seminal document that we want to tie everything back to. This makes it all really simple, creates that awareness. And so today what I want to do is just go through in our nutrient management section, go through these par, birdies, and eagles, and kind of expand on these thoughts and explain a little bit more about them, in addition to that awareness that just you might get from reading this. So the first par I want to talk about, I kind of narrow pointing to it here, knowing your nutrient needs, and that just means soil testing. So before we talk about what we can gain from soil testing, why it's useful, I think it's good just to talk about how you soil test. For people that haven't done it before, there's quite a few in our surveys that haven't. Basically what you need is a soil probe. And what you can start with is just a couple greens a year. So you can also do these on tees or fairways. It's most common to do them on the greens because that's the most intensely managed surface on our golf courses. And you don't have to do all your greens every single year. I would suggest if you've got 18 holes, do 6 greens and make sure you have a representative sample. So that might mean, hey, taking 2 of your worst greens, maybe those are shady areas, low-lying areas that you struggle with, 2 of your best greens, and then 2 in between. That would be a good way to get a representative sample. When you sample a green, you're going to go ahead and take 8 to 10 subsamples. What does a subsample mean? That's just one of these soil probes, right? Over here, about 8 to 10 of those per green based on the size. And you're going to make sure you have a consistent sampling depth. So this is really important. You'll see over here on this soil probe, I have a little strip of duct tape. Now I sampled to 4 inches. I've seen 3 inches recommended as a sampling depth. Or the length of your root zone, whatever you choose, it's just got to be consistent every single time. I've got this strip of duct tape here that every time I put that soil probe in the ground, it catches the grass right at 4 inches. So I know every sample I take out is that depth. That's important because nutrient concentrations can change as you go down in the soil. So you see a little soil core right here. The soil concentration of any nutrient may be higher or lower up in this top 1 inch than it is, say, at 3 to 4 inches, right? So if you change that, if you're variable on your sampling depth, it creates variability in your samples and the data becomes not as reliable. So consistent sampling depth, important, and same time of year. Again, going back to that consistency component. So that's really basic soil chemical testing. You can look up a little bit more on the process if you'd like. But bottom line, you take your samples, you send them off to a lab, and you get something like this, which is a matrix of numbers, usually in Excel. And again, if you're not familiar with soil testing at all, what do I do with these numbers, right? Are they good? Are they bad? I don't know. You need a method to interpret those results. And the simplest, most science-backed way to interpret those results in turfgrass are the minimum levels of sustainable nutrition, MLSN for short, guidelines. So there's other interpretation methods out there. We like the MLSN guidelines because they were developed specifically for turfgrass with thousands of samples. So the folks at Pace Turf and Asian Turfgrass Center spent years getting soil test results from turfgrass, looking at that data and developing these guidelines. And they're very simple to interpret. Basically, all you need is enough, right? So 37 parts per million, if we're looking here at potassium. If your soil test says 60, you're good to go. If your soil test says 120, you're also good to go. 120 and 60, not really any difference there. There's no optimum amount. That's the difference between this interpretation method and some other ones. All you need is to be above 37 parts per million. And they say, you know, through their data, that's plenty for the turfgrass to have what it needs to grow. Right? We're not farmers. We're not trying to grow yield here. We're not trying to grow as much as we can, right? So we don't have an optimum. We just need enough to sustain healthy turf. And that's what makes these guidelines really simple to interpret, really easy to understand, and they're backed by data. So, okay, why use the MLSN? One of the reasons is because of that data-driven methodology to develop them. The other reason is it's probably going to suggest you fertilize less than other interpretation methods. So this is some data we got from our work down at Sunken Meadow State Park. Helena Chemical came in and they mapped our soils using an electromagnetic induction device, really cool device that helps us target some soil sampling. They generated a map of the soil nutrient concentrations on every hole at the golf course, 27 holes. Worked with a professor at SUNY Farmingdale, Nick Menchek. And so they used that data, that base data, and they interpreted it using two different methods, right? So we have SLAN, which is another soil test interpretation method, and the MLSN we just talked about. So if we look at SLAN, it says, okay, you need 110 parts per million of potassium. They go through the hole based on the nutrient concentrations they calculated. They recommend 560 pounds of potassium. So that's a good amount, right? That's going to cost money. It's going to have time associated with it, spreading that fertilizer out there. Using the same base data, that same data, now just with the MLSN method, which says you only need 37 parts per million. Oh, look at that. We need no potassium needed to apply. And that soil testing method will say, hey, your turf grass is still going to be healthy with that amount of potassium. So that's just an illustration there of the MLSN method. And it typically will recommend less fertilizer. And that means saving you time and money. And so this is what soil testing looks like over time. And I like this idea of trends. Professor Doug Soldat, who talks a lot about soil testing, will say the same thing. Looking at soil tests over time is really what you want to notice trends, not necessarily the short-term kind of diagnostic tool, but more a long-term. His analogy is, you go to the doctor, you get your blood pressure every time, and you just want to be in a range, right? And notice any trends over time. So this is one golf course, one specific green. We've got a couple years of soil testing data here, and we notice trends, right? Here's phosphorus. I've got the MLSN level right here. This course uses MLSN to fertilize. And as you can see in 2016, 2017, they were getting right at that phosphorus MLSN level. They began to notice some purpling here and there. So they said, okay, it's time for us to apply some fertilizer, get us just enough above that level to be good for a couple of years. And in fact, that's what they're doing. So that's one way over the long term, you can use this data, notice trends. You might also use the pH. Sometimes they give you an organic matter number as well. If you've got some observations from your golf course, are the greens performing well or not so well? Maybe you can start to dial in certain things. Hey, I noticed my golf course got better when I went from 2019 to 2020. Maybe you can start to notice things, pH or potassium levels, they change. You can develop some site-specific kind of MLSN levels for yourself. And so what we do at the Cornell Turfgrass Research Center, we test every year. And we kind of look for symptoms of nutrient deficiencies. And we won't apply fertilizer unless we see something like, for example, a phosphorus deficiency. Now, over the years, we haven't applied much phosphorus. We haven't seen the purpling that's associated with phosphorus deficiency. The last time we tested for phosphorus, we got 3 parts per million. The recommendation by MLSN is actually 21 parts per million. So we're woefully deficient in phosphorus, yet we don't see any symptoms. Why is that? Well, the folks who produced the MLSN guidelines actually built some safety factors in there. So those numbers are actually a little higher than even they could recommend just for safety's sake, even though they're lower than any other soil testing interpretation out there. So, for us, our site-specific MLSN might actually be lower than the numbers you get. And that's actually pretty common for people who use MLSN. So that's how you begin to soil test, how you use the data, track it over time. One of our PARs we think every golf course should do, annual soil testing. Another one of our PARs, don't apply late. And we're referring to fertilizer here. Traditional wisdom, the theory has always been, hey, a late season, late fall application of fertilizer will help that spring green up, right? And so looking through some data from the folks at Minnesota and Wisconsin, recently did some studies looking at fall fertilizer applications, mid-September, late September, October timings, November timings. And what they said is, hey, November applied nitrogen was essentially the same as October when it comes to that spring color and quality that we're looking for, right? So what they're saying is, well, whether you apply it in November or you apply it in early October, you're still going to get that same amount of spring color and quality. But their conclusion was, hey, if you're putting it down in November, the grass is growing less, right? It's colder, there's less sunlight. What you're going to end up doing is wasting that fertilizer, right? If the grass isn't using it, if it's not growing in November, that fertilizer's got to go somewhere, and where it's probably going to go is the water, right? So you're not getting any additional benefits from spring color and green up, but you're probably wasting that fertilizer. So the conclusion here is, hey, why don't you do that fall fertilizer earlier, whether it's late September, early October, at the latest mid-October. You're still going to get those spring color benefits, but you're not going to be wasting that fertilizer and letting it leach out into the environment. So it's important to note here that fall fertilizer is still important, right? It's still important for that spring green up and increased rooting. We see a lot more rooting in the fall, and just a little bit of fertilizer can encourage that. But late being November, being late October, we want to avoid applications of fertilizer after that. Another reason to avoid late season fertilizer applications, snow mold, pink snow mold. So this is research out of Cornell that Frank did with Mary Thurn years ago, looking at various seasonal rates and late season rates of nitrogen and potassium. So I'm just going to block off the sets here that there's basically a low, medium, and high potassium rate for each one of these blocks. And in every little block of 3, you'll see that the high potassium rate has more snow mold. And it gets worse as your seasonal rates are higher, right? Basically what this is saying is, hey, those late season applications, especially when they have some more potassium in them, are going to lead to more snow mold. So another reason to avoid those late season nitrogen applications. Again, every golf course can do that. We think that's a par. Finally, again, I talked about this earlier. We do this pretty good, but calibrating application equipment. We get to talk to Rick Slattery, our colleague on this project, former superintendent. He's told us really the importance of calibrating all your application right at the start in spring, right? Before you get out there, let's make sure we're not having any mishaps, spraying or spreading stuff. And then doing another one, maybe early summer, right? So catch yourself halfway through the season, make sure, do that little check, make sure everything is going well. So probably 2 times a year, calibrating application equipment is ideal. And then this idea of having checkpoints during the application. Hopefully a lot of people do this, but Maybe when half your spray tank should be used by, hole 7 or whatever it may be, have that as a checkpoint. When you're going along, have your applicator get out and look out, say, okay, yeah, have I used half my tank? Are we good to go? That way you don't spray the whole golf course with a nozzle off and a streak down every fairway, right? So again, there's a lot of resources on this. I spent a lot of time looking through different resources. Just a couple here you could look at from Kentucky and Penn State. There's videos, there's documents that will help you do this. So a lot of information out there if you're not familiar with that. So just to review the PARs, right? Things we think every golf course should do: soil testing. It's between 10 and 15 bucks for one soil sample submission. So if you're doing 6 greens, it's under $100 to do that. We think every golf course can afford that on an annual basis. We think that's a par. Using the MLSN guidelines, again, something we suggest to everybody: these late season fertilizer applications, avoiding those, and calibrating equipment. So those are our pars. Now on to these birdies, right? This next level of nutrient management. First one we're going to talk about is growth. And this is certainly an idea that's taken off a little bit. If I'm reading the tea leaves and seeing what superintendents are doing a little bit more of these days, in tune more with the amount their grass is growing. And this birdie version of this BMP is just to start observing that, right? And the best way to do that, ask your applicator, or excuse me, your mower in the morning, goes out and mows greens with buckets. Hey, how many times did you dump, right? If it's 6 times, right? Oh, okay, grass is growing a lot. Maybe I start thinking about my fertilizer application. Well, I'm scheduled to go Monday, but he's dumping 6 times every time he mows the greens. Do I need all that fertilizer? Can I cut the rate? Do I need to fertilize at all? So adjusting your fertilizer applications based on the amount of times you're dumping, is a good proxy for growth. If you want to do this for fairways, this is a great photo from Michael Vesely, right? Baling hay on fairways. Get some observations from your equipment operators. Is there a ton of clipping buildup? Do I need to fertilize those fairways here soon? So the idea here is to get off of that kind of schedule basis of fertilizer and bring it back to growth, right? Because we care really about the growth of the grass, not what time in the season we're in. So this is just some data that's kind of outlining how variable a year can be year to year. We've got 2020 last year here in blue for Ithaca. 2021, we see very similar temperatures. The last 2 years, almost identical. So we might think, okay, yeah, temperature is related to growth. So yeah, I could do the same thing I did last year, right? Well, hold on a second. We've also got light levels, right? So we can look at light right here in this middle graph. And we see that we were pretty similar up until April. And then, wow, we really fell off a cliff with our light levels in Ithaca this year. Actually, until July, our light levels were basically like a normal April. So we think about grass, right? Needs light for photosynthesis to grow. And okay, our light levels are really different. That's going to change how much our grass is growing, right? Similarly, soil moisture, right? We've been getting a lot more rain, right? It's been cloudy, overcast, getting all these rainy days. That's why we have less light. It's why our soil moisture is higher. So again, soil moisture contributes to growth. We know these are all things that affect growth that are really independent of the date, right? They vary year to year. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to fertilize on a schedule. It makes more sense for us to fertilize based on growth. So just observing that growth, we think is a birdie, being flexible with your fertilizer applications. So another thing relating to growth is traffic, right? And I don't think we could find a better picture illustrating traffic for the year of 2020 than this. It's a drone shot of the 16th hole at Green Lake State Park. 2020, the year of the single cart rider. And you can really see that cart traffic right up the right-hand side of this hole. And what we're looking at here is obviously this part of the rough, maybe this corner of the fairway, getting driven over a lot. There's a lot of traffic. That's going to cause the grass to grow less, right? So over here, we can see the stress on that grass, while over here on this left side of the hole, right? Not many people going over there, maybe a couple, but receiving substantially less traffic. So what are we thinking about in this area? Well, if single cart riders are going to be a thing for the next 3 to 5 years, hey, we might need some fertilizer in this area, right? Or else it's going to end up like these classic kind of dirt patches that happen on a lot of golf courses where there's just concentrated traffic. The turf grass can't grow enough to sustain itself, ends up thinning out, right, and dying. So here what we're saying is, hey, we should change our fertilizer rates based on how much traffic there is. And this is an example, right? Just a visual example where we'd say, hey, maybe throw some fertilizer here. We don't need it over here. But what if we use some data for this? We were really excited to partner with the USGA here and use part of their Deacon system. They have a GPS golfer tracker program where they essentially send you little GPS devices. We stood there on the first hole and handed them out to golfers at our golf course here at Cornell. So the golfers would put them in their pocket, clip them onto their belts, and every 5 seconds that GPS would log where that golfer was on the golf course. So over the course of 18 holes, we could generate what this is, which is a heat map of golfer data, where they spend the most time on the golf course. So quite literally data on traffic of the golf course. And this is the 6th hole at Cornell as a dogleg right par 5. And really interesting to see the traffic is centralized really on the right side of this fairway. So we know, most golfers are right-handed, most golfers slice. This is data that's confirming that and really telling us exactly where they slice it to, right near this bunker, into the rough, but not so much on the left part of this fairway, right? Look at how much less traffic this left part of the fairway receives compared to the right. So we're going back to growth and fertilizing by growth and traffic. These things are interlinked. Do we need the same amount of fertilizer on the left side of this fairway as we do on the right? I would say the answer is probably no. How you handle that is tough, right? If you have a GPS sprayer and variable rate technology, we think you're good to go. You put this in there and you set it up. But more practically, maybe this is something where you're skipping every other application on the left side of this fairway, right? It's going to grow more. It doesn't receive as much traffic. It doesn't need as much fertilizer. Or maybe you bump up the fertilizer rates and you get a pass into the rough over here because it's getting more traffic. And you can even start extending this into the greens, right? So more data, the 12th hole here at Cornell. You can see this front right portion of the green, heavily trafficked. On the ground, we notice that's a pretty firm area. It tends to thin out because there's centralized traffic in there. So again, we can move our fertilizer rates around to address that. And so why do we care about this? Well, part of this is to create consistency, right? I think we've all had a golfer probably come up to us in your time as a superintendent who says something like, oh, my ball's hit and released on the 7th hole, and then on the 13th hole it hit and it spun back. Why can't the firmness be the same? Or, oh, this green is faster than that green. When we start moving these fertilizer rates around to account for traffic, the idea is to create more consistency in our playing surfaces. So that's speed, that's firmness, that's accumulation of organic matter, right? If everything's growing at about the same rate, it's not going to produce organic matter at different rates. You're not going to get fatty places here where there's no traffic and thin places where there's lots of traffic. So that's, probably the primary reason I would say you should start to look at traffic and adjust fertilizer rates accordingly. Also unnecessary growth, right? We don't really need the plant to grow a ton. Again, we're not farmers. We need to grow it the right amount. And when we have that unnecessary growth, it's pulling nutrients out of the soil, it's pulling carbohydrate reserves out of the plant, making it less resilient for later in the year, maybe when it needs it more. That unnecessary growth doesn't help us out. So using this kind of traffic and fertilizer combo, hopefully reduce some of that. And that also kind of translates into these disease problems that are historically associated with high nitrogen or low nitrogen. We could also think of those as high growth or low growth diseases. Brown patch, high growth disease, typically on the other end, dollar spot anthracnose or these low nitrogen could also be considered to be low growth diseases. So again, this is going to help us even these things out and hopefully avoid some of those issues. Just a quick review, right? The birdies on our nutrient management, we're starting to observe growth, hopefully, and observe traffic. Maybe make some changes in our program, in our management practices, considering these variables. So now we get to the Eagles, right? And these are the things that, right, it's going to start to require a little bit more effort, maybe some data analysis. We're going to throw some data in there at you, a little bit more analysis and effort on your part. but I think they're going to really make a difference, and they have for a lot of people. The first eagle is measuring our growth rate now. So a lot of people are doing this. This has been a trend in the last 5 years that I've seen. Measuring, we call it clipping volume, right? Hashtag clip vol on Twitter is what you'll see. Pretty simple, right? We're mowing grass off greens. We're usually collecting in buckets. Most people mow greens with buckets. That's great data. If we just measured that grass, that's the exact amount we grew in the last 24 hours. It's right there in our hands. Let's just measure it, right? So you dump it in a bucket, you measure it, and you write it down. It's really simple. It takes less than a minute. And you do that every day. What bucket to do, how to look at the data. You can go, and Micah Woods has an ebook. He wrote a whole ebook on clipping volume. That's how important it is. I'd encourage you to go check it out. But at its core, it's really just a very simple process. So now you're measuring instead of kind of guessing, right? Earlier, that Birdie version of Go by Growth, you're kind of observing, you're getting some feedback from your operators. That would be like the golf metaphor is like kind of standing into an approach shot and you don't see a yardage marker. You're kind of just ballparking it. Like, it looks like 150 or it looks like 200. Once you start measuring clipping volume here, I'd say now we've got the rangefinder version, right? Measuring, boom, 167, boom, 205 to the pin. It's a lot more accurate, a lot more precise, and it's going to be better data to go off of. So your question, okay, well, who's doing this? Eric's doing it, Alan's doing it, Jamie, Rob, LJ, we've got dogs doing it apparently. It just goes on and on. I can find a bunch of pictures from Twitter of people doing it. And there's a lot of success stories from this. A lot of people finding this to be a really valuable piece of data that has helped them managing their green surfaces. And as a matter of fact, we've done it at Cornell. And this was a little case study we started a couple of years back with Superintendent Dave Hicks. So in 2018, I kind of peer pressured Dave into measuring clipping volume every single day of the year on a couple greens. This is data from the 5th green. It's the first thing we kind of talked about was, okay, we're going to measure this data for a year. What do I do with it? And we said, hey, the first year, just don't do anything with it. Just take it and let's make some observations. Let's note when the greens are good, when the greens are not so good. And at the end of the year, we'll go and look back and see if we noticed any trends. So you can see in 2018, the orange line, some big swings in growth, right? And so what we noticed with these swings in growth, first of all, is that they would happen after really heavy rains, right? So all of these spikes that I'm having putting arrows at are 1-inch rains, 1.5-inch, 2-inch rains. We got some really big rain events there in 2018. So we'd get a rain event, a couple of days afterwards, we'd see the grass just shoot out of the ground, right? Huge spikes in growth. And when that turned into is non-ideal playing conditions, right? So a lot of grass growing. What does that mean? It means slow greens, soft greens, greens that change in quality throughout the day very quickly, right? If they're growing a lot in the morning, that might be okay, but okay, by noon, they've already slowed down. By 5 o'clock, they're getting bumpy. So noticing that, hey, that high growth is way too high. It produces bad playing conditions. But also during the year, we made sure to make note of when the greens were good. And it turns out in this kind of gray area, we call it the Goldilocks zone, anywhere from 15 to kind of a 7-8 range, the greens were really good, right? Consistent throughout the day, good speed, good firmness. They withstood the amount of traffic for the amount of daily play well. So that was kind of the Goldilocks zone. And so after looking at that data, the end of 2018, 2019, Dave said, okay, I'm going to make some changes here. The first thing I need to do is maybe get some better drainage in these greens. Let's get some more sand in there, pull out some organic matter. Hopefully that will reduce these big changes, these big spikes in growth after rainfall events. And the second thing he did is, okay, I'm going to use clipping volume when I go out for my fertilizer or plant growth regulator application. I'm going to look at that clipping volume data and adjust it accordingly. So, okay, if I'm seeing a lot of growth, hey, I might up my PGR rate and decrease my fertilizer rate because I don't need to grow more, I need to grow less. So as you can see, 2019, just a year after collecting that clipping volume data, much more consistent growth on this 5th green, which translated to consistent playing conditions on the 5th green. a couple spikes here and there, but overall a lot more time spent in that Goldilocks zone. And it's something he's kept up with and kept an eye on over the years, because it's really helped him dial in those nutrient management practices on his greens. So greens, obviously the place to kind of implement that. Rick Slattery and I talking about, well, okay, can you do this on bigger areas, right? Fairways or tees. Most people are probably not collecting clippings in buckets on those surfaces. Maybe some of you are. Most people probably returning those clippings. Just an idea that you could do out on those surfaces is measure height. This data is from my home lawn, right? Every time I go out and mow, which is not often enough, I take a height measurement of the grass and then calculate essentially the growth per day since my last cut. And this might be something you could start to use on your fairway areas to dial in nutrient management practices there. Again, for plain consistency's sake, and maybe that helps you save fertilizer over time, which on those big fairway areas is going to add up to a lot more than say a green area. So we're almost down to our last nutrient management BMP here, which is writing it out. What do I mean by writing it out? These are nutrient management plans. Only 14% adoption based on our surveys. So this, again, as I was talking about earlier, we had a lot of conversation with superintendents around, okay, why don't you have a nutrient management plan? What's that about? First thing I would get is, the point to the old noggin, it's all up here. I don't need to write it down. I know it. Other reasons, kind of these barriers for producing a nutrient management plan on a piece of paper, too much time, and that's completely understandable. And then also you don't know where to start. There's a couple of resources online that talk about a nutrient management plan, but I can certainly relate to those two, right? Taking too much time and not knowing where to start. So, in our solutions, we have to start addressing these barriers, right? So, okay, why is it important to write it down as opposed to just having it in your head, right? And I would say the first thing and most important, I think, for a lot of superintendents is that it's going to help us stay one step ahead of regulations as an industry. Right? We have to show some initiative on our part that, hey, we're writing down our nutrient management plans, and that maybe you don't have to legislate fertilizer use through proposed bills, sometimes which have some science-based recommendations, sometimes not. If more than 14% of our industry had a nutrient management plan, maybe they wouldn't consider some of these proposed bills. So I would say if more of us had a document that explained how exactly we fertilize our golf courses, that there would be less inclination on the regulatory side to prohibit sales or applications of nitrogen or any sort of fertilizer. Another thing I think is really important and maybe understated is communicating with ownership. Right? Words matter, and we talk to our owners or greens committees or boards, and that's all well and good, but sometimes it doesn't come out how you want it to. Sometimes people selectively remember things you say and misinterpret them. If you can write that down on a piece of paper, you control your message, right? You control what people are going to read about how you apply nutrients on the golf course. And it's everlasting, right? You can always refer them back to that. I think it streamlines communication, makes it more simple. So there are two reasons to write it out from that aspect. And then the final one is you may actually learn something. When you're writing down a nutrient management plan, maybe you're forced to think about, okay, why do I do this with my fertilizers? Is it just because I've always have done it, or is there a reason behind it? So maybe you learn something while you're writing down your nutrient management plan, or maybe you actually commit to something. There's a lot of research that says, hey, when we write something down as a commitment, we're more likely to carry out that goal. There's these pledges down on Long Island for homeowners to reduce nitrogen pollution. You could think of your nutrient management plan, documenting that as a commitment, and maybe that helps you kind of solidify some of the practices you do out there. But as to the taking time component and where do I start component, Frank and Rick and I are thinking about this, and we said, hey, what if we just created a template? And it was a fill in the blank, and it was easy. It's this kind of TurboTax version of a nutrient management plan. It addresses those concerns, because it's all right in front of you. It takes less time. You don't need to go searching around for what data to include. So that's what we did. On our website now, we have this PDF that's fillable, right? You just click in yes, no. There's a couple of areas you got to enter some information, but we've tried to make creating a nutrient management plan simple and easy. And this template is a way to do that. So just a, example here, we've got again, we're carrying out these par, birdie, eagle concepts, right? So we're asking you, do you do these things? Not that you have to do them all, but we have those par, birdies, and eagles right next to them to kind of underscore, hey, okay, this is an advanced concept. This is one we think everybody should do. So hopefully people check that out. I'll include the link below our YouTube video here. We'll send it out in the chat. But this is a really easy way to create a nutrient management plan. We call it a worksheet. And once you fill it out, then it's a plan. Becomes something you can give to people, and we'll give them all the information they need regarding your nutrient management plan. So, those are the par, birdies, and eagles of our nutrient management plan section. All right, finishing off here, measuring growth and writing it out, really important. So I think I'll stop there, and we'll see if we have any questions from the audience or from you, Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I get the pleasure of, talking this through with you all the time. So I have, a number of clarifying questions, and I guess it begins with what we learned in the survey. And I think you said it, and I just want to make sure that you and I and Rick, our colleague, also, sort of are clear about this. I would say when it comes to fertilization, most people we talk to said, oh yeah, I have a plan. I know how I fertilize. I know what I do. And I don't really know. Just, I go out about 1/10 of a pound a week. Or, you get some, particularly on greens, bragging about, oh, I haven't put a pound on in 2 years, right? So you get this variety of things. Can you take a minute, and it's really what you ended with, can you take a minute and say, what's the difference between what we think we are doing as an industry and what we think we need to be doing? You really covered it in a broad way. I wonder if you can narrow it down to say, here's what we've sort of learned you are doing when it comes to this sort of nutrient management planning idea, thinking through what you're doing. And you went through it in a really granular way about the various levels that they can do it. What's the difference between what's in your head and what gets in this plan?
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned it there a little bit, Frank, that some people may be fertilizing and they may be employing all these BMPs I talked about today. And they might be people who go out and advocate for the turf industry and say, hey, yeah, I'm doing this, and a lot of other people are doing it. When we get these representative samples of surveys, this random data, we get a true kind of indication of what people are doing. And the reality is there's piecemeal things going on. Some people may be actually applying according to growth, and they don't even know it, right? This is a feel-based thing. And, a lot of people who tell me, oh, feel, we'll go out and we'll be feeling the grass, and they'll say, hey, it's growing a little bit too much. I don't need more fertilizer. And they don't even know they're fertilizing based on growth. And they might not even be able to communicate that to people. They may just say, hey, I'm a feel guy. But writing that down is really key, because then that reinforces, yes, you are in fact fertilizing based on growth. And some people on the other end may just have a schedule, and they may think, yeah, I've done all this due diligence and I've scheduled all these things out, and I've talked with a bunch of people, but they're actually not as reactive to some of these growth things. So on a piece of paper, they have a nutrient management plan, and that's really good. But hey, okay, let's think more about growth, and let's be a little bit less, a slave to that schedule and that workbook. So I think, like you're saying, Frank, there's a lot of things that in your head, sometimes we like them so much, we want you to write them down, because sometimes they don't come out when you're talking about them. And then in other cases, people might have a lot of things written down, but not things that necessarily we would recommend in a Eagle version of a nutrient management plan.
One of the things I like that you've done very successfully is say, obviously this is a water quality pollution prevention project. We're trying to bring some precision and specificity to the way we fertilize and manage nutrients on these large expanses of land, that are used for recreational purposes, and we call them golf courses, right? How when you think it through, do you generally think that things that are really good for playability are probably really good for water quality protection?
I think so. I think, the tenet you will always hear, firm and fast, that lends itself to less nutrient use, right? Maybe it's more the brown color, the gold is good color. I know the USGA with Pinehurst many years back. Those sorts of things inherently are kind of towards the lower nutrient management end. So there is some crossover there, but I think also, talking about traffic, high traffic areas, I'm completely fine with saying you need more fertilizer in that rough area if you have single rider carts. And sometimes that sounds contradictory because we said, hey, one of our BMPs is not to apply fertilizer in rough, but there is that, there's these changes, there's these niches that, hey, in this situation, I do think you need fertilizer here. And being able to say that because of the concepts we're creating, going by growth, going by traffic, it doesn't really, so your question about nutrients and playability, in most cases, I think lower nutrients probably better for playability, but there are some cases where, hey, I think you need to go higher on nitrogen to reduce dollar spot, to reduce anthracnose, so that you're not spraying pesticides. We'll get to the pest management portion of this later, but sometimes fertilizer in place of pesticides is a good thing.
Yeah. And that's the transition. That's the perfect transition I was looking for, because traffic is obviously a pest, a stress, if you will. And if left unmanaged, leads to soil compaction and turf thinning and soil erosion, weed invasion, and then pesticide use. And we can take it out of the rough into the fairway. You look at the amount of divots or the traffic in a landing area where maybe you got a bunker jutting out where the whole fairway is pinched and everybody's going in the same spot. And then you get the dollar spot and the pythium and the brown patch in those areas where if you could target some nitrogen use in that place, you'd probably have fewer problems. If you could target soil cultivation in those places, you would probably have fewer problems. And being able to maintain, full turf cover for a lot of the places that we visited in our surveys, these smaller scale focused operations, as the USGA would say, if 100% turf cover is really good, that's what they should be striving for, 100% turf cover that gives you a playing surface. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't sort of bring Rick in to say, hey, just remember, there's ways of doing this that are more responsible and simple and practical and make sense. It's not just a couple of academics saying, oh, let's get satellite data and do it this way. Rick always tells us, hey, it can be simple, it can be practical, and you can really make a difference by doing that.
Yeah. And to end on that note, I think, Frank, we're talking about these par birdies and eagles. It's important. We aren't expecting everybody to do all of this. Right? We're not expecting every facility to go out there and do this GPS USGA data, but having those, the BMPs that are a step away from that, right? Just observing, keeping down in notes. Rick has a nice little note that he would keep a journal every year, observing things about his golf course on a weekly basis, on a daily basis. So, okay, you don't have that specific data, but hey, you've got your observations, and I would call that data. I would call your observations when it's in a notebook and it's written down, that's data. If it's just in your head and it's, hey, yeah, 3 years ago, I think this worked. I'm not going to buy that as data. But, so the end goal here, what I'm talking about is I don't expect everybody to be eagling everything on these infographic posters, but, get your pars in order, right? Be a consistent player. As Zach Johnson, let's par a bunch of holes. Then let's figure out how to birdie the par fives, right? Birdie when we can. I think those are the important concepts. And
that's a perfect place to end, Carl. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I do think we did, by your impetus, create the par birdie eagle concept. And I do think we expect people to meet par. I don't think it's unreasonable. And we really tried to make par, it's not a Robert Trent Jones BMP process. It's not a difficult par. It should be an easy par. And then we want to give you shots for birdie and eagles as your resources and time allows. So thanks again, Carl. Really appreciate that. And big shout out to Rick Slattery, who, we wouldn't be really doing this without him keeping us honest and being our compass for, how we get these things implicated. So thank you all for joining us for this second in a series of BMP webinars. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next bunch. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.